the way that, when he says that women should come under the Constitution, but in Sparta they don't, it may be kind of mysterious to you because you're thinking, well, does that mean that women are going to be citizens in the sense that they're going to go to an assembly and vote and they're going to hold office? That doesn't seem to be what Aristotle means, okay? He doesn't advocate, we don't see him advocating women voting, we don't see him advocating women holding office, okay? So he's far from Plato, at least Plato's Republic, on that issue. So what he means by women should come under the Constitution, but in Sparta they don't, is that women were considered purely private, okay? At least this is the way he sees it in the Spartan Constitution, which means that their husbands ruled them, okay? Their husbands were their law for them, okay? So that they were not treated the same as the male citizens, okay? If you understand what I mean? So if women did something wrong, it was the husband's responsibility to chastise his wife or to keep her in line doing what she was supposed to do. He was supposed to govern her, and he was responsible for her actions, okay? Whereas the male citizen was responsible to the state. If he did something, if he got out of line, the law applied to him, and so forth, okay? So when Aristotle says that's not a good idea, he has particular reasons why, and they're kind of interesting, okay? He says that when women are purely private, when they're not considered citizens under the law, they don't have any sort of attachment to the city, you know, they don't pay any attention to the politics of the city. They are thinking only about their husband, and their husband is their vehicle, okay, for whatever, you know, they want, for the good life, okay? Because there's no other vehicle, and pleasing him or displeasing him is paramount. But Aristotle says that women, just like men, have ambition, so to speak, okay? Just like men, women want to have good things, they want to have a good life, okay? And the problem with purely private women is that they see their husbands as not just their bosses, which is what I'm sure the Spartans wanted out of that arrangement, but they see their husbands as people who can be manipulated, okay? Now, the interesting aspect to this is that Aristotle recognizes that the sexual power of women, basically, in relation to men, okay? So this sounds terribly old-fashioned and sexist to us, but what he's talking about is that women can manipulate men using their sexuality, okay? Which, you know, either they can give or withhold, okay? They can make their husbands' lives easier, or they can make their husbands' lives a living hell. And so, in effect, what happens, he says, in a lot of these Spartan households, okay, is that the women end up ruling the men. It's ironic, okay, because the opposite is supposed to hold true, but the women end up ruling the men because the men are so entirely important to them, okay? If they cannot control their men, they have no control at all right? Does that make sense? So they figure out that they can use their sexuality, that they can use their ability to make the household either run harmoniously or not in order to manipulate their men. And Aristotle says that is the same as having women rule. So he's not, and obviously he's not an advocate of having women rule. It's kind of interesting because on the one hand he's saying, like men, women have ambition. Women are human beings. Women are not slavish. They are not, less than human. They have a different nature, okay? But they want control over their lives just like men. And when you leave them no other options, okay, but to operate through their men, they will use their ambition to do so, okay? So that's where he's coming from when he says, so in all constitutions, this is in the middle of page 50, in all constitutions in which the position of women is bad, half the city-state should be regarded as having no laws. Okay? And another example of the women's situation, being bad would be if the husband wanted to abuse his wife in this type of society, the woman would have no recourse. There's no law that applies to that in that type of system. Okay? So, that much power over women means women's focus, again, is entirely upon pleasing and manipulating their husbands. So he says, and this is exactly what has happened in Sparta, for the legislator, wishing the whole city-state to have endurance, makes his wish evident where the men are concerned, but has been negligent in the case of the women. For being free of all constraint, they live in total intemperance and luxury. The inevitable result in a constitution of this sort is that wealth is esteemed. This is particularly so if the citizens are dominated by their women, like most military and warlike races. Isn't that interesting? Okay? Because you would think the opposite would hold, and from a legal perspective it did. Okay? But he's saying, the legal situation and the real situation were two different things. Okay? Interestingly, he adds, except for the Celts and some others who openly esteemed male homosexuality. So it is understandable why the original author of the myth of Ares and Aphrodite paired the two, for all warlike men seem obsessed with sexual relations with either men or women. That is why the same happened to the Spartans, and why in the days of their hegemony many things were managed by women. And yet what difference is there between women rulers and rulers ruled by women? The result is the same, which obviously isn't good in his point of view. Because he thinks, again, remember, that unlike what he thinks Plato suggests, that males have one virtue and women have another, that male's virtue is to rule, to have authority, and women's virtue is more what we would call nurturing and managing. Okay? And so I think that's why he thinks if women rule, the result is worse. Okay? All right, so does everybody understand this point? I'm not going to ask whether you agree or disagree with it because there's no winning on that subject. But surely everybody can understand the point of manipulation, and you could even say that it might go both ways, but that people can become ruled by their sexual interest. Mm-hmm.
So does Aristotle like what's happening in Sparta, or does he not?
He does not like it.
So women should be private?
No, he's saying that women are private in Sparta, that women are not, they do not come under the law. They're supposedly ruled by their husbands in Sparta. And the result is that they have an incentive to manipulate their husbands. Whereas in a better city, and Athens was really not that much different, I have to say, but in a better city, women would come under the law. Okay? They wouldn't be rulers, but they would be citizens. They would come under the law, so that it wouldn't just be their husbands that they would have to worry about. Okay? There would be legal expectations of their behavior. The state would be the one to regulate their behavior, to punish them if they committed a crime, etc. And so that would broaden their views, supposedly. They wouldn't be just concentrating on their husbands and what it takes to please and manipulate their husbands. They'd be thinking about the community as a whole.
Okay. Okay,
does that make sense? All right. Maybe another example would help a little bit. Probably, I can guess, I guess I'd need to look this up to know for sure, but I would guess that in both Athens and Sparta there was a law against female adultery. Okay, so in Sparta there would be, basically the law would support the husband doing whatever he wanted to do to punish female adultery. Okay, so I guess I misspoke. There wouldn't be a law. The government would support the husband. The husband could decide whether he wanted to let it go, whether he wanted to, beat his wife, whether he wanted to kill his wife, okay, for adultery. In a better city, where there's a law against adultery, there would be legal ramifications that would be stated. Here's what happens if you commit adultery. Okay, here's what happens if you desire a divorce. Okay, and so forth. Which is better for women in the sense that they're not just sort of under the arbitrary rule of their husband. Okay? Women in the Spartan situation would just be sort of subject to the luck of their original marriage. You know, did they get lucky enough to have a moderate husband or whatever? It also makes the women in a better city think about the laws, because those laws apply to them, and think beyond just the needs of their household and their husband, you know. And, you know, what Aristotle is particularly worried about is women who use, in cities where they don't come under the law and they're purely private, women who use their sexuality to manipulate their men into doing whatever it takes to be successful, okay? So they're more likely to be warlike, because in Sparta, you know, the great warrior is the most highly esteemed and the most successful. So a woman in Spartan society would be urging her husband to be warlike, to get involved, to, you know, to promote war, okay? And to do whatever it takes to prove himself, to get more power, to get more wealth, because that's how she becomes successful. Okay. All right, so, but he doesn't go so far as to say women should be treated as equal citizens with equal rights to participate. Okay, that's a different matter. All right. So, I mean, in effect, for the longest time in most societies practice the, you know, men are citizens, women are private system, right? Where the men provided the government for their family any way they wanted to. And Aristotle is pointing out that has ramifications for the community, because you've got 50% of the community with no incentive to care about the larger community, whose only incentive is to care what their family has and what their husbands do. Okay? And that leads the husband away from thinking about the overall community and trying to prove himself to his wife, to try to please her so that she will be compliant. Okay? All right. Now, this sounds a little bit detrimental to women, because Aristotle concludes that this is a bad situation. If women are ruling in this fashion over their husbands and manipulating them, then they're really ruling, and that's not as good as if men were ruling. Okay? So you may think Aristotle is pretty much back to what you would predict any, you know, traditional ancient Greek figure would be on the issue of women. But he is a little different, and Arnhart points this out. We've already looked at this one passage that Arnhart references, but I'll read it again. He says, "For free rules slave, male rules female, and man rules child in different ways, because while the parts of the soul are present in all these people, they are present in different ways. The deliberative part of the soul is entirely missing from a slave." Okay, and he means that natural slave that we talked about. "A woman has the deliberative part of the soul, but it lacks authority. A child has it, but it is incompletely developed." Now, if you think about it, whatever Aristotle means by the woman has it, but it lacks authority, is different from it's incompletely developed. Okay? So that makes people wonder, what does he mean it lacks authority? It's not that he's saying that women's deliberative or their intelligence is immature, because that's what he's saying of children, and he's distinguishing the two. Okay? He says, "We must suppose, therefore, that the same necessarily holds of the virtues of character too. All must share in them, but not in the same way. Rather, each must have a share sufficient to enable him to perform his own task." And that makes us wonder if what he's saying is authority, meaning in the way that Aristotle thinks, he looks at what is the nature of man, what is the nature of woman. And what he sees is that men are, in his view, more aggressive. Okay? They're more likely to take action. They're more likely to decide, etc. Okay? That's the way he sees it. And so, and women are more likely, as he sees it, to be passive, to listen to many points of view, to not make decisions and so forth. Again, whether these observations are true or just based upon what was going on at his time is an open question. Okay? So he's probably thinking a woman has the deliberative ability, but because of her nature, which is to not be aggressive, to not be decisive, etc., okay, it lacks authority. So if that's true, then authority simply means a spirited nature, that men have that spirited nature, supposedly. Okay. And he links this all up with the different virtues. There's different virtues for men and different ones for women. He says it's evident then that all those mentioned have virtue of character, all of them, and that temperance, courage, and justice of a man are not the same as those of a woman. As Socrates supposed, the one courage is that of the ruler, the other that of an assistant, and similarly in the case of the other virtues too. Okay. So that's kind of interesting that Aristotle's not a path breaker on this issue as Plato seemed to be to him. Okay. But yet he is not relegating women to unthinking or childlike status. Okay. And Arnhart points out in his book that, and I haven't done this, so I have to rely on him. I haven't read Aristotle's biological and zoological writings, okay, but he wrote them all. And he says that when dealing with animals, Aristotle never claims that females are less capable of learning, but actually points out that females are more capable of learning or more clever. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. I don't know what that means for his teaching on women, human beings as women anyway, but it's interesting to note. Okay. So just to sum up, Aristotle treats women as caregivers. They're natural caregivers. They're naturally suited to managing the household, caring for children. Okay. He says they should be treated as citizens. That is, for him, it means they should come under the law. The laws need to apply to them. So their husband is not their arbitrary ruler. Okay. They fall into the area of having to give consent, which is what he means by the marriage should be like a constitution, a constitutional rule, in which the husband has the authority, but he does not simply dictate to his wife. Okay? So he's describing a more mutual relationship in which the wife's views are heard and considered. So the husband deliberates. Of course, this, relies heavily on the quality of the husband, which is why, many women have objected to this scenario. It relies very heavily on the quality of the character of the husband. Okay. But Aristotle is saying husbands should not treat their wives like slaves or like children. They're adults. They have a deliberative ability. So you can see a type of marriage in which there's communication, to use our current lingo, and input, right? But somebody has to decide. Aristotle makes that abundantly clear. Somebody has to decide. Marriage is not a democracy in his view. And so the ultimate decision lies with the husband. Okay? Now, can you see how this teaching supported the traditional view of marriage for a long time? Okay? Aristotle was a great philosophical authority figure for a long, long time. And his views about natural human relations held a lot of sway. Okay? And even in the early years of our own Constitution, before women could vote, the idea or the philosophy behind this institution of male suffrage, okay, was that the males represented their families. Okay? that it wasn't that the women were not citizens, but that in a marriage, the males represented their wives, and that the family was one unit, and therefore the husbands represented everybody. Okay? So this ideally how it was supposed to work and how it would have been justified. Okay? Look, we don't have two separate minds here. Now, nowadays when you go, I've done canvassing in the past to door, like anybody interested in politics, and you find that there's lots of marriages where the wife is one party and the husband is another, right? So they cancel each other out. And I wonder if they just decide not to go and vote. Maybe that's where it comes from. But not that far back in history, that was a situation that would have been, unheard of, even after women got the vote. There was a real, push for concordance, for agreement. The family was supposed to be one unit, and the husband's opinion on politics prevailed. In fact, I can see this in as I've mentioned before, my parents are from the World War II generation, and my mother was raised a Republican. Her father was a Republican and a businessman in Iowa. But when she married my father, he was a Democrat. He came from Kentucky. He was, his dad was a roofer. He was very pro-union and so forth. And so upon marriage, my mother became a Democrat, because if she wasn't a Democrat, there would have been a lot of conflict in that marriage. Okay? And so, but to this day, I get the sense sometimes that they're not in perfect alignment, but my mother still votes Democrat. Why? Because to them, that's what it takes to hold a marriage together. You don't want to have too much argument. They also have their traditional roles. Mom cooks all the meals, and Dad continually fixes and builds things. So, all right. So, any questions or comments on Aristotle's teaching on women? Anything that you're curious about or don't understand? All right. So all he's saying is, which is far less than Plato. Plato is saying. And again, this is just in the Republic, but in the Republic, he's entertaining the idea of women being educated exactly the same as men. They're going to be in the ruling class the same as men. They're going to be in the military. Okay, it's extremely innovative and radical. And Aristotle is certainly taking a far step back from that. But he's saying women should be citizens. Women should come under the law and not be thought of just as ruled by their husbands. All right. So what we see so far then is Aristotle differing from Plato and Socrates in that privacy of the individual and family, their private, in other words, their private relations are important. They're not just to identify with the community, so he disagrees with communism. He disagrees with communism of property too. Private property is good. And he disagrees with, and in this case, the Spartan situation where men are ruled by women. He says women should be ruled by men, but not excluded from the life of the community. Okay? All right. He also begins to talk in Book 2 about the best way to govern a city. We've spoken briefly about this before, but this is an important concept for Aristotle because he thinks that in Plato's arrangement, most people aren't citizens at all, and they have no ability to participate. And he says that in the best city, everybody should take part in ruling and being ruled in turn. Now that doesn't mean that everybody takes a turn at being king or having some high-level office, but that everybody takes some part in ruling, even at much lower levels, depending upon their ability. Okay? So those who have great ability are naturally going to gravitate to the highest offices, But everybody is going to be expected to participate somehow. And that might mean, you know, in today's parlance, you know, taking your turn at school board or on the city commission. Or in Manhattan, we have all sorts of boards. We have a board for public health. We have a law board. I mean, most people don't even know these exist, but these are a group of citizens who have a particular interest in that area, and they serve for, I think, 2 years at a time. And they have input. They give input to the managers, the people who actually do this work, like the health department. Okay. And if you don't do that, maybe you might get involved in a civic organization, which used to be pretty tied up with the local communities, politics, providing services for other people. Okay? But this is what the city should be about for Aristotle. Okay? Participation. And you can't reach your full potential in his view without it, without being a part of it. As he said, you know, if you're an individual and you think of yourself as isolated, you're not fully human. You haven't achieved your full potential. There's a lot of people like that, right, in our own society. They're not connected to their community. They're not paying attention to local, state, national politics. They're not involved in a community organization. Okay. Why do you think that is, that so many people, if this is a natural urge, as Aristotle says, and we're political animals, why is it that so many people in our own society don't participate in any way? I mean, a lot of people don't go to a religious service even. I mean, that would be one form of sort of communal participation, right? But that's dwindling. You know, weekly service attendance, service clubs, memberships are greatly dwindling. You know, voting is like usually under 50%, even in presidential election years. Mm-hmm.
I think it's harder to care about politics in the sense of, like, I don't know, there's a lot of argument and just, I don't know, it's easier just to be comfortable as long as you have everything you need, you know, you can not worry about it.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess it depends on your job too and like what affects you, but it's easy to not care and just kind of, do whatever you want.
Mm-hmm. Is it the negativity, you think, that turns people off? So there's so much disagreement. Yeah. Can you see how in a smaller community like the city-state, that might not be as much of a problem? I mean, in a larger society, there are so many, and especially in one such as ours, there are so many points of view, there are so many interests. This is what James Madison thought was so genius about our society, that we have so many factions, that the factions would sort of neutralize each other and no one could take the lead. But it makes politics less pleasant, you might say, yeah. So I think that that's true, that, you know, that a lot of people are turned off by disagreement. Some people love it, okay? The truly political person in our society is a highly competitive type who likes the feeling of winning and doesn't mind becoming negative, okay, if necessary to get that job done. But for a lot of people, because of our social instinct, you could argue, that negativity is unpleasant. And so they tend to not want to get involved in it. They don't want to argue with anybody. They don't want to be contradicted and so forth. Aristotle envisions not this massive, you know, republic, but the more coherent city-state. So this is partly why he can envision this experience being fulfilling, okay? Because if there's enough agreement about basic goals, then what you're deliberating about is not so contentious. Okay, it's not so negative that people are frightened by the experience. Okay? So that might be part of why there's a difference. There's not nearly the level of focus on individualism in the ancient city-state as in today's America too. That's a huge difference. I mean, we're very highly individualistic compared to people back then who were much more inclined to think of themselves as part of community. So There's that. Okay, so if this sounds a little unbelievable to you, it may be partly because of the difference in the situations. Okay, and yes, a lot of people duck. You know, if you get jury duty, that might be the only time that the government calls on you, so to speak, where you actually have to go unless you get out of it somehow, you know, and serve. So, which happens if you're a citizen in Manhattan. I think I've gotten called to jury duty about every 2 years for most of the time I've been here. So, okay, so Aristotle, to make things less contentious and more harmonious so this will work, he notes that there has to be, all classes need to support it, all types of people need to be in that basic agreement. So he's already taken care of the problem with women, okay, supposedly, all right? Now this is more of a problem, you know, how do you get the rich and poor to see that these common basic interests in common, okay? Well, he does have some things to say about the economics and how economics can divide people and what you can do about it. As I already mentioned, he advocates for a strong middle class. And generally, governments back then didn't pay any attention to developing the poor to bring them out of poverty and into a middle class. Okay? And so he says things like, you know, it's in the interest of the government to level property, for instance, to make some changes so that the very rich don't have so much property and it gets redistributed. Okay? It's not the same thing as communism, but it certainly is government intervention to make sure that there's not this huge gap between the rich and the poor. And once again, he leaps on Sparta as an example of a city-state that doesn't do things well. But a lot of the same situation applied in Athens. There were a lot of poor people and a few rich people. But he says about the ephors, or that's translated as overseers, a body of governors in Sparta who were made up of the wealthy, of the aristocrats. He says, matters relating to the board of overseers are badly organized, for this office has sole authority over the most important matters, but the overseers are drawn from among the entire people, so that often, I've got these mixed up, yeah, these are the people that are elected, so that often very poor men enter into it, who because of their poverty are open to bribery. Yeah, sorry, I get these different groups mixed up. So the ephors, the ones who were selected who were poor, who didn't have any sort of independent source of wealth, viewed their position as a way to make money. Okay? And so they were open to being corrupted. And this is one of the problems with the poor. If you have too many poor people in society and you try to include them in participation, they're very likely, naturally, to see that as an opportunity to enrich themselves. So they're more likely to become corrupt. Does that make sense? So poverty pushes people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. All right? If the ephors came from the middle class, supposedly they would not have this temptation to corruption, and they'd be more likely to rule well in the interests of the people. Okay. So while you're taking those notes, I'll turn to, we haven't read this yet, or I bet you haven't, but there's a particular spot in Book 4 where he elaborates on this, the necessity for a middle class. So I'll read it now because it applies. He says, it's clear, therefore, that the political community that depends on those in the middle class is best too, and that city-states can be well governed where those in the middle are numerous and stronger, preferably than both of the others, so larger than both the rich and the poor, or failing that, than one of them. For it will tip the balance when added to either and prevent the opposing extremes from arising. That is precisely why it is at the height of good luck if those who are governing own a middle or adequate amount of property, because when some people own an excessive amount and the rest own nothing, either extreme democracy arises or unmixed oligarchy, or as a result of both excesses, tyranny. For tyranny arises from the most vigorous kind of democracy or oligarchy, but much less often from the middle constitutions or those close to them. So the middle class is extremely important, and probably the most important problem for most of those ancient city-states, because it was rare for there to be that large of a middle class. And most of the political conflict in these cities came from rich versus poor. Okay? The poor had their numbers, so they would rise up. The rich had money, so they could afford more military support, and they would clash. So this is where a lot of the civil conflict came from. All right? So he starts to call the Constitution he likes best the middle Constitution, because it is neither a government by the rich or by the poor, okay, but by the middle class. He says conflicts and dissensions seldom occur amongst citizens when there are many in the middle. Large city-states are also free from faction for the same reason, namely that more are many in the middle. In small city-states, on the other hand, it is easy to divide all the citizens in two so that no middle is left, and pretty well everyone is either poor or rich. Okay? So he places a lot of emphasis on this. And can you see how if a city had this, if a city-state with maybe 200,000 to 300,000 people and it had a large middle class, how there would be enough concern for the common good, how there would be enough moderation that the political dynamics would not be so negative that people would flee from participation. Okay. And of course we know that property makes people tied to the interests of their city. So the more people who have it, the more their own self-interest will make them interested in the city. Okay. Can you think of, what I've got on my mind is all of the times that President Obama and other leaders, but particularly President Obama, has mentioned the middle class. Think about that. In almost every speech he gives, he talks about the middle class. Okay? And not just him, but just about any president that I can remember. He talks a lot about the middle class. What's going to hurt the middle class, what's going to help the middle class. How have you reacted to that constant mentioning of the middle class? Does that seem reasonable to you, or do you think that they place too much emphasis on the middle class?
Well, it seems reasonable because you can understand why he would want to identify with the middle class, just because they're the largest body of constituency.
Mm-hmm.
But I kind of think it's almost to the extent of pandering, even though that happens in democracy, but it kind of seems a little bit more with how much he employs it.
Mm-hmm. Because they're the voters, they're the ones that are, you have to pay attention to the middle class.
Well, not only the voters, but the largest group of voters.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yes, yes. And in America we have, now Aristotle looked at the middle class, I'm pretty sure, just as an economic thing. In other words, it had to do with the amount of money and property you had would make you the middle class, in the middle class. But as these sociologists have pointed out, in America, the middle class has become a state of mind too. So it encompasses a lot of people. People who might technically be poor, but they have a roof over their head and they have a job and so forth. They might still identify with the middle class. So when a politician gives a speech and he talks about helping the middle class, they would include themselves in that. So it reaches a lot of people, especially in this country, because everybody, even pretty rich people, if you ask them, what class are you in, they're very likely to say, I'm in the middle class. Okay, so it encompasses a lot of people. Okay, so yes, I think politically it's a wise move. Okay. Can you see how, lots of times when I hear this, I react, well, what about the poor? Politicians spend a lot of time talking about helping the middle class, but the middle class if you look at it just in economic terms, has already got, you know, at least what it takes to take care of itself. Shouldn't we be talking about the poor? But now that you've read a little bit of Aristotle's view on the middle class, does that make a difference in how you see that rhetoric? You see how important the middle class is politically, not just as a, you know, constituency that votes for you, but to preserve the middle class. It's kind of interesting because Aristotle's saying without a large middle class, without a lot of people in that class and thinking that way, you don't even have a stable democracy. You're going to get class conflict. A lot of times I think President Obama's been accused of causing class conflict, you know, but with his discussion of the middle class, okay, and his focus on the middle class, you could also argue he's trying to avoid class conflict, okay, by recognizing the political importance of the middle class. Okay? It's the stabilizing influence. It's the part of the electorate that cares the most about the political future. The very wealthy are always going to be able to take care of themselves, no matter what, you know, no matter what happens. If they get, you know, 90% of their income taken in taxes, they won't like it, but they'll still manage to survive. The very poor, Aristotle would say, don't have much of a stake in the system. Their only interest is getting something for themselves, you know, so that they can hopefully be a little bit better off. And they usually want to take it from the wealthy. The middle class just sort of wants things to remain the same, wants to have the property it's got and build on it. And so it doesn't make strong demands from the government, but it cares about the future, the stability of the regime. So I don't know if President Obama has all that in his mind when he uses those terms or when he talks so much about the middle class, but we might cut him a little bit of slack in that perhaps he's aware that the middle class is the source of stability in our regime. Okay. So I will leave this up here. I'll talk a little bit about it, and then we can get to this next time. But Aristotle advocates what he calls the rule of law and not of men. This is part of what he means when he says you must have constitutional rule. Okay. Again, differing from Plato's Republic, Plato said the best government is one where the wise rule, right? And if you can find wise people, then whatever they say, that's going to be the best, okay? However, Aristotle is dubious as to whether you can find such a quantity of truly wise people. And even, you know, Plato was dubious about it too. So what do you do if you can't find that? Well, you have to have people in charge who are interested in maintaining the Constitution and not arbitrary rule. And this is where he gets into criticizing the Council of Elders. These are the rich aristocrats, okay? And they are typically older, wealthy men. They hold the office for life, he says, and this aspect of the Spartan Constitution causes all kinds of problems because these guys tend to be arbitrary. They tend to make rules that help themselves and their friends, okay? He says some of them aren't even in a position to make decisions because they get so old that they're senile, okay? But there's nothing the Spartans can do about it because their constitution is set up so that they cannot be removed. It says on page 53, if the senators were decent people with an adequate general education in manly virtue, one might well say that this office benefits the city-state, although one might dispute about whether they ought to have lifetime authority in important matters, since the mind has its old age as well as the body. But when they're educated in a way that even the legislator himself doubts that they are good men, it is not safe. So these are just wealthy men whose main education has been through their families, through their families and the inheritance of their wealth. They're not educated in the interests of the city. They don't really care about that, and they're ruling in their own interests. And he says, in fact, In many matters of public concern, those who have participated in this office have been conspicuous in taking bribes and showing favoritism. This is precisely why it is better that the senators not be exempt from inspection as they are at present. So there should be no body where people are just given rule and rule for life without the possibility of being removed for corruption or for not doing their job well. Okay? Does that make sense? Again, he's hammering on the Spartans, but this is his basic teaching, is a good city doesn't have this type of institution where people just inherit their position, and then they can abuse it and they can't be removed. Okay? And since they're wealthy, they don't really care about, supposedly, about the good of everybody else.